Welcome back to the follow-up. I'm here with Pastor Jack and Pastor Ryan. You guys preached this week on Romans chapter 4, 1 through 25.
Yep,
The whole thing. And what were, like, I'm always curious about this, and we didn't plan to ask this, but what's some of the feedback that you guys get after a sermon, specifically this one?
Well, so I had my opening illustration was about my dad, and I spent a long time kind of like, I don't know, hamming it up, saying how awesome my dad was. And
which he is, by the way.
He is. He's amazing. Yeah. But what I didn't know when I was writing that illustration and getting ready is that my parents were going to be there on Sunday.
Funny.
And so like that was the biggest feedback I got was people like were going up to my dad and talking to him, and just it was kind of embarrassing. But
That's funny.
I don't think people were listening to what I actually said in the sermon.
That's the problem with a powerful illustration.
I guess,
people remember the illustration sometimes.
That's true.
Or when you
And
call out
nothing
someone
else.
in the audience, who they can all go
Yeah.
Yes,
stare at them,
absolutely.
so that's not awkward at all.
Yeah.
One big takeaway, I think there were a couple of small ones. I don't think there was anything big. This was a lot more of a comparison, bouncing off of chapter 3, kind of embodying it with Abraham. Just the fact of the expression of God's unquestionable love for you. We can talk about that all day long, and there's still going to be people who are just like, I'm trying to embrace it, you know? But I think the reality of who Abraham was in flesh and blood, not perfect, and yet there is the promise, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, that God's love has not changed for him. And we're going to see that later in Romans too, when we get through Romans 8. So yeah, that was one of the big feedbacks that I got consistently with it.
Yeah, that's really cool. So one of the things about your title was you used this idea of the credit score.
Yeah.
Can you talk about like why you use that analogy and clarify that?
So I would like to, because when we first started talking about it, I was in college ministry for a lot of years, where I was in Virginia at Virginia Tech, go Hokies. We had a restaurant actually called Daddy's Money.
Whoa.
And the students who went there, it was not cheap. And the students who went there, you knew their parents had money. So they literally would go in and eat off of their parents' money. It was their credit. They couldn't afford it.
Yeah.
It was credited to them based on their father's account.
Yeah.
And as we were talking through the message, that picture kind of came into my head as we looked at Abraham.
Yeah.
And we just started talking about our credit score. Like it's not on us. We don't have that kind of credit. We don't have that in our account. It's what our Father has done for us. And Paul is clear on that all through Romans, but specifically here with Abraham as the example. So that's where that credit score thing, I can't afford this, you can't afford this, we can't pay for our own deeds. It's credited to us as righteousness. That's kind of where the idea started.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, you had a little bit different take on that.
No,
didn't
I
you?
mean, I think that whenever you're looking for illustrations and thinking about, okay, how do I make something clear in this passage?
Sure.
One of the things that was there, like Jack was saying, is that this term that Paul uses is an accounting term to like move money from one, account to another. It's credited in that account. And so then we were kind of bantering about, credits and credit scores came up. And I, to be honest, like know that I have a credit score, but I like didn't know that much about it. So Jack was kind of explaining it to me like, oh, this is what a credit score is. It's, this financial report card essentially shows how trustworthy you are with money based on what you've done. And so we were kind of contrasting that with our credit score, if you will, before God, this declaration that we are righteous. It doesn't come of what we've done. It's come from, what our Father has done through Jesus, So, that ultimately we have nothing to bring to the table. We've got all deficits and no assets. So, our credit score is in the tank, but God credits us with his own righteousness.
Right.
Yeah.
So Jesus is like the ultimate cosigner.
Well, you know what? That's what I was talking through with Jeff Pittman. That's what he said. He's like, oh, God is like a cosigner. And I was like, well, I don't know what that means.
More than a cosigner. More than a cosigner.
And that's the problem with any illustration is it break down if you press it too far, but it can be helpful for us to remember spiritual truths.
Right.
To have
Totally. Okay. So in Romans chapter 4, a big piece of it is talking about Abraham. And Paul kind of uses Abraham as an example. Can you flesh out a little bit more about like why specifically he chose Abraham as an illustration for the Old Testament and kind of what points he was making? You don't have to redo the sermon, obviously, but just like flesh that out a little bit more.
Yep. I was going to say what I had studied said that Jewish people, Jewish Christians, would go back to Abraham to basically support this argument that if someone was going to come into the church, if they were going to become a Christian, they first needed to become Jewish, because it all kind of started with Abraham. And so there was even this idea in Judaism at the time that Abraham, must have been a law keeper. He must have had the law revealed to him even before, Israelites got it at Exodus, because he was just this righteous person, and he was kind of the paradigm of what it means to be right with God. And so I think if we do a little bit of kind of historical reconstruction, Paul is writing to this church in Rome. It's got Jewish people and non-Jewish people in it. And the Jewish people are, trying to tell the non-Jewish people, hey, you basically got to become Jewish before, you become a Christian, or you got to at least be doing these things. And Paul's saying, like, no, actually, if you look back at Abraham's life, this guy that they were using to support their arguments, he's like, if you actually look at Abraham's life, that's not what happened. God didn't, make him right and have right standing after he was keeping the law, because he was circumcised, all these things. It actually was prior to all of that.
Yeah.
So like he kind of tracks with the story of Abraham to say, what order? Let's make sure we get the order right in Abraham's own story. Did he obey a bunch of things and then God said, you're righteous? No. It was before he had done anything, before he was circumcised. So I think that's where he's jumping in there.
Well, and this is a character everyone would have known a story right away. I mean, Abraham is the GOAT, right?
Yeah.
He is the one that every Jewish person, anyone in Israel's history is going to go, this is it. This is like our bedrock of foundation.
Yeah.
So to be able to use Abraham's life, that's hard to argue with. And with all the hundreds of laws out there at the time that they could have, well, what about this law? What about this law? Well, this person followed this much. Because another one I read about was Job. See, Job had to know something because he's declared upright too. Did he know something? Well, Abraham just did it because he had the right relationship with God. Tell me a better example of someone just faithful. So in Jewish history, folklore, foundations, he went to the go-to right away. Like, he didn't play with anyone smaller. He went right to the key figure.
It's a little bit like in political arguments, people go back to like the founding fathers to support their, they want to argue for a particular thing today.
Right.
They say, well, George Washington did this, or Abraham Lincoln did this, and they try and ground their own position in some historical figure in the past.
Right.
And Paul's doing that with Abraham. He's saying like, hey, it's all about believing. That's how you get made right with God. And I'm going to prove that by going back to the originator of the faith. Even the guy you think is on your team, he's actually supporting my view of this, which is God's view of this. That's
I like that.
And then take that to the next step of him saying, hey, Israelites, Jewish folk, he's not only your dad, he's like all of our dads.
Yes.
So welcome in your new brothers and sisters that you didn't even know existed.
I wanted to call it Who's Your Daddy?
Who's Your Daddy?
I thought that wouldn't be a great.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. There is a real piece in this passage of like, you kind of see Paul's like, yes, he's explaining all these like theological ideas, but at the same time, you can kind of feel this background push towards unity.
Yes.
Right? Like, when you go back to it, what unifies us? Well, it's faith. It's not it's not all these things you're trying to earn. It's not if you're circumcised or not. It's not if you have this heritage. It is faith,
Yeah, and I would say, just hold on to that idea until we get to chapter 14 and 15, because it's all about unity. It's like you guys are fighting over these different things. He's trying to hold them together, and the whole first part of the book just supports that idea of being unified. How can we be unified? We're so different. We have such different backgrounds. We have such different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds. And it's all because of the gospel. The gospel just levels it all and says you're all in the same position before God, in your sin and through Christ.
And it takes it from being a blended family, like we're out here and we're out here. No, we're grafted together.
That's right.
We are one family. This is coming from one tree. So we're different. And we're different, and our backgrounds and our stories and our religious understanding.
Yeah.
But once we're in Christ, with that root going back to, with Abraham, it's like, no, you're one family.
That's right.
Even no matter what the difference is, you're in Rome. You some of you are hoping to be Roman, some of you are Roman, and you're blending it. There's no blending with Christ. There's no blending with Abraham. It's the same root.
That's right.
Yeah. There is kind of been a theme emerging in Romans so far, and it's this idea that maybe the past way of thinking about how to relate rightly with God, that is not true, right? Like you could never perfectly follow the law, right? And even if you could, you're still sinful. So like there's all of these things that are pointing us to like there is a way to be right with God, and it's through faith. It's by God's grace, right? And so I don't think we talk about grace in the right way sometimes.
Okay.
And so I would love for you to share with us what does it look like to practice dependence on grace? Does it mean that I just get to do whatever I want throughout the day, and then at the end of the night just be like, thanks for God's grace? Like, what does that mean to be dependent on God's grace, the way that Paul's been laying out here?
Well, I think there might be two sides to it that I'm thinking about right now, which is, on the one hand, grace just means a gift, right?
Yes.
It's a generous gift. So on the one hand, if I know that my right standing with God is a gift, it's purely based on a gift, then that changes the way I think about my own sin. I sin, I mess up, I fail, and instead of feeling totally ashamed and guilty about that and like I need to earn something before God, I can confess those things to him and then rest in his grace. And there can be peace and say, like, you know what, God, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry that I've broken your heart. I'm sorry that I've broken your commandments here. I thank you so much that my right standing with you is not dependent upon that. It's this free gift that I receive. And then grace is not only about that forgiveness piece, but it is also a gift that transforms us. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he's like, I worked harder than any of you, but it wasn't me, but it was the grace of God working in me,
Yes.
So it's like, so actually grace is also the gift of transformation, not just forgiveness, but then transformation. So then it's like, Lord, I want to do better next time. We have that, feeling, which is good. And then it's like, ultimately, I can't even do better next time on my own strength. Like I have to just say, I need you. And would you supply, the power that it takes?
To your point, I think the peace, and it goes back to what I heard even this weekend, is like accepting that grace. Like, man, it's a nice package. I think you used this actually one of your last illustrations. No, it was Adam, where I mailed you a gift. It's yours. It's free. Do you want to pick up the gift? It's sitting at the post office waiting for you. Do you want to pick it up? And all of us go, man, I love the idea of God's grace. And thank you for it, but I'm just not good enough for it, or I can't live up to it. So it's taking and applying, like accepting the gift, applying the gift, living in it. It changes your mindset. And what'll happen is how you express it to others. Yeah. I've noticed people who have trouble accepting grace really have trouble giving it. And people who have trouble giving grace keep their own bar standard like unbelievably high, law keeping high. So I think for me, it's a give and take. You'll see it come out of you once it's in you, once you've been able to embrace it for yourself.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, it's a hard thing because I think sometimes people, they hear grace and they just think, well, then why do any of the rules matter?
Right.
Why do
anything goes?
Anything goes? And it's like, well, the deeper vision of grace from God is a gift to us, and it enables us to live the life that God wants us to live without that like hangman's noose hanging over us.
Yeah.
Like my relationship with God is right now. So because it's right, because Christ already paid everything, now I can live in freedom to love God and let him change me and grow me and transform me, like you said. Yeah. And so I think I think that'll come out more as we go through. So and grace is always a fun topic to talk about.
I go back to Paul saying, but the law is good. So think about even the purpose of the law. Yeah. It was gracious.
Yeah.
It was boundaries for our good and our protection. Bible Project does a great video on how the laws came into being. And the laws weren't meant to be restrictive in a form of oppressive. They were meant to be restrictive in a form of gracious, like this is for your good. So I think when we don't combat them against each other, instead we see the law is good and has a purpose for pointing me to God. Pointing out the problem, which can make me right with God. That's, I think it puts grace in a proper pocket along with a proper understanding of the law.
Yeah. Amen. Well, we could probably keep talking about this. In fact, this is just like the end of a conversation that we started earlier before we actually hit record. So, but thanks so much for joining us, and thank you guys for joining us. We will see you next week on the follow-up.